Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our conversations with Gibran and the Prophet. We're giving 30 lectures on the Prophet, and we are now in lecture 11 on clothes, where the Prophet al-Mustafa will give us some insight into, again, technologies. Now, we are building off of the previous lecture number 10 and the passage on houses, and we will now mess around with clothes. And then from there we'll go to the last of these, buying and selling. All technologies are somehow going to be subsumed in this evaluation. You'll remember that in the previous lecture, and our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side is our playlist, and that we gave a set of introductory comments, and we mentioned there in that intro that there are 12 drawings that came with the Prophet, and they're quite remarkable, and you want to run them to ground. Look at them. We've given you an online version of the Prophet for you to look at if you don't have your own physical copy. These drawings are amazing. Notice the drawings will have the individuals in them will be naked. They'll have no clothes on them, and so we're going to maybe have something to say about this as well. You'll remember in our previous lecture that he points out that technologies, using euphemistically houses, is that he will say, first we invite them in as guests, then they become a host, and then finally they become our master. I think that this is compelling, again, when we're looking for a spiritual view, an integralist, a spiritual view of this idea of clothing. And we'll be back to the Genesis 3 passage. We talked about this at learnstrong.net when we did all our lectures on Milton's Paradise Lost of 1667. You can go and run those to ground, but you'll remember that you have this pivotal moment in the biblical account of Genesis 3. When Eve eats of the forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil with the talking serpent and all of that, she then will speak to Adam and let him do the eating as well. And then there's this there's this moment when they recognize that they're naked and they are ashamed, and then of course they try and hide from deity and they try and clothe themselves. Standing behind all of that, of course, will be this passage here for al-Mustafa and for Gibran. We know from some biography and autobiographies of Gibran that when he was young and the rain happened, he used to love to run in the rain, maybe even out in Lebanon where he grew up, even possibly without his clothes on, to feel the rain on him as a child. Go back to your reading of Huck Finn. You'll remember, and Tom Sawyer as well, the Mark Twain's classics. You'll remember that one of the things that defines Huck is that he hates shoes. They are a symbol, of course, and we're going to play the same game here. And in the end, of course, for Gibran, as well as Huck, it always comes back to freedom, right? So let's play that game now. And the weaver said, think about it this way, the weaver, who will, of course, know how to make clothes, form and function of clothes, but maybe not completely comprehend the spiritual function of clothes. So a weaver said, speak to us of clothes, and he answered, your clothes conceal much of your beauty, yet they hide not the unbeautiful. Now, this will take us back to our study of Hamlet. You'll remember that Hamlet will say in Hamlet 3 to Ophelia, I've heard of your paintings too well enough. God hath given you one face, and you make yourselves another. You jig, you amble, you lisp, and nickname God's creatures and make wantonness your ignorance. But we call that in our comments at learnstrong.net on that passage the Maybelline challenge. In other words, putting on the makeup to try and hide. Gibran will play a similar game in regards to the clothing, and you'll remember that earlier in that same play, Hamlet, Polonius will say to his son Laertes in 1:3 that the apparel oft proclaims the man, and he talks about how in French culture they love clothing. It's an interesting question to ask. When we wear clothes, what is it we're trying to conceal? And then what is it that you can't hide even with clothes? And again, the spiritual view is the one that Gibran is headed towards. And though you seek, now to continue the poem, and though you seek in garments the freedom of privacy, you may find in them a harness and a chain. Now, the paradox, of course, is that we're needing desperately to cover, but why cover so much? Like, what is that about? I think the argument that he's making here is less about we should all just take off our clothes and run around naked. Nobody wants to see that, to quote any number of us, right? But more particularly, what is it that clothes are for, right? And he'll say it this way. Would that you could meet the sun and the wind with more of your skin and less of your raiment. Now, to speak in the time and place in which Gibran is writing these lines into cultures that are going to specifically say you should cover a whole lot of your body, and if you're female, all of your body. This is pretty radical stuff for the time and day in which he's going to make the argument. For the breath of life is in the sunlight, and the hand of life is in the wind. He has these lines that are so beautiful. In other words, don't allow your clothing to get in the way of your relationship to the sun and to the wind, to nature. Some of you say, and we're familiar now with this construction enough that we're growing familiar with it, right? Some of you say, quote, "It's the north wind who has woven the clothes we wear." In other words, we need protection. And I say, aye, it was the north wind, but Shane was his loom. Now we're back to the Genesis 3 passage. Shane was his loom, and the softening of the sinews was his thread. And when his work was done, he laughed in the forest. Again, we're back to, you'll remember in the previous passage, it was grinning on houses. He laughed in the forest. Forget not that modesty is for a shield against the eye of the unclean. Go back to on houses and his observation about the eyelid and the eye. In other words, we have to try and live our lives, guys, with as much freedom as we can. And instead of trying to hide flaws, accept those flaws, what we might call, living with grace, right? Forgiveness, both to ourselves and others. And when the unclean shall be no more, what were modesty but a fetter and a fouling of the mind? In other words, when we have evolved to the point, you'll remember that Thoreau said it. I believe that government is best which governs not at all, and when we are ready for it, he says that's how he prefaces it. In other words, if education is doing its job, it's helping us to find a more wholesome, holistic, integral approach to all of our lives and to the way we see ourselves and each other. And forget not that the earth delights to feel your bare feet, and the winds long to play with your hair. It's a short passage, but it's a brilliant passage, especially when you put it in this kind of three-part understanding between houses and then in a second buying and selling. The idea is what at 2a? Well, I think he's making the argument that freedom should be our guiding principle in all things, especially as it relates to technologies, right? And first of all, our own freedom, and then obviously the freedom of others. Think about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty as a 3a suggestion here. In other words, don't allow technology to interfere with your natural self. Some have read this poem as looking at the body again in positive ways instead of shaming ways. Why is it that we so regularly look at ourselves and our first instincts are shame? Oh, I got to cover that up, as opposed to feeling the freedom and the joy that the human body is majestic. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't take good care of ourselves. Of course, we're all familiar with that in terms of our diet and our exercise and all of that, our sleep. We know that. But we should never be in a situation where we are so ashamed that we feel like our clothing is what has to cover up our, the things that are wrong with us. Right? It's sad. It shouldn't be that way. At 2b, I love the allusion or the referencing, especially here to Genesis 3. I mean, Gibran is doing this very subtle but very compelling, the way he'll take a standard passage like Genesis 3. Well, of course, they saw that they were naked and they were ashamed, and transforms it in some compelling way. At 3a, well, we mentioned Genesis 3, as well, of course, the previous passage on houses, the grinning, and now enclosed, the laughing. In other words, don't allow it to get in the way. I mentioned the references in Hamlet 1:3, the idea that the apparel oft proclaims the man. You are what you wear in some interesting ways. At 3b, it is interesting to ask why you wear what you wear. So I ask you, okay, so why are you dressed the way you are? I like it. That is a child's answer. Okay, I'm happy that you like it, but why do you like it? Some of us will think a little bit more about the clothing that we wear as being allowing us to have the freedom of movement and the like. Others, we got to send messages and the like. Thoreau, you'll remember, said in Walden, "Be careful of any enterprise that requires new clothes." It's one of the great lines of all time. And yet, we've got to learn to balance and live in a world where people judge in relationship to the clothing that we wear and the like. Finally, in what ways at 3b do your clothes define you or free you? And it is interesting to kind of study the history of garment making, especially in the 20th and then the 21st century, where so much of the clothing had less to do with status and more to do with releasing and freeing the human spirit. Now, from houses to clothes, we finally go to buying and selling, and that one will be a wonderful passage as well. I hope you're being challenged. Thank you.